Welcome to Holistic Accountant Podcast, where we aim to showcase how adopting a holistic approach in accounting and tax maximizes value for clients. Beyond traditional tasks like preparing financial statements and tax returns, a holistic accountant focuses on offering advice that maximizes personal wealth on an after-tax basis. If you enjoy this episode, please consider leaving a rating and sharing it with those who might also benefit. And to ensure you stay updated, subscribe to our weekly email. The link is in the show notes. Okay, today Mena, I would like to talk about what are the 1 to 3 really key things in your business that you should be focusing on. It's like the old 80-20 rule, that 80% of your outcomes will come from 20% of your effort. And the challenge with running a small business is there's always things to work on. You're always putting out spot fires, you're dealing with a client that needs something relatively quickly or a staff member that needs some training or questions answered. And so you tend to rush to the urgent at the expense of the important. But what we find is that there tends to be one area that you should spend most of your time on. That is that there's one area that if you could nail it, if you could turn around it and take something that is average to above average or something that's below average to above average, that it would have the most dramatic impact on your business, both from a efficiency perspective. So I guess that's, making the business easier to run for its owners, or from a profit perspective, or from a revenue perspective, or satisfaction perspective. I mean, there's many different things we might want to optimize, and quite often improving one of these things will optimize all those factors. So we've categorized them into kind of the 4 Ps, if you like: people, pricing, product, and process. And we think they're the 4 areas where if a business isn't performing at its maximum, one of those 4 areas is probably under par. And it's then about really critically identifying which part in your business isn't working. And so let me start with the first one, which is people, which is really the team in your business. And both Mena and I strongly believe, particularly if the business that you're in is a service business, that you can't build a fantastic business with average quality people. The key will be making sure that you've got the right people in the right seats, and they are in fact the right people, and you can't compromise. If someone isn't perfect for your business, if someone doesn't have all the skills and attributes that you're looking for, if they're not bringing all the energy that you're looking for and the level of productivity, then it's going to be really difficult to build your business. It's akin to sort of rolling a ball uphill versus rolling it downhill. So there could be lots of different things that you might need to do in your business to improve the people aspect of it. Apart from obviously just having the wrong people, that's a really critical one. And Mena and I have spoken about this in this podcast before, but a really great question to ask yourself is, would you enthusiastically rehire everyone in your business? And I underline enthusiastically. And if you can answer yes to everyone in your business, well, you've got at least the right people in the business. Of course, if you can't answer yes, then that is your first port of call. You need to make some changes and decisions so that you can answer yes to that question. But once you can answer yes to that question, there could be other areas that you can improve, like training and coaching. If a person is a great person in your business but just doesn't have the right training, right oversight, or right coaching, they can't perform at their best. And that could be, how to service a client, could be product knowledge, could be what to do when things go wrong. Well, I've had a couple of really great examples in hospitality more recently. We went to a really fantastic restaurant. They nailed everything. The food was great. The service was great from most of the wait staff. The fit out was awesome. They would have spent millions of dollars on this fit out. But the person came up and cleared the plates when not everyone had finished the course that we were on at that time, which you wouldn't expect in the place that we were at. And it really was something that really stood out. And you thought, well, that's just a training issue. Someone hasn't said to that person, don't clear the plates until everyone at the table has finished the course. And it's a really easy thing. They did all the hard work and just that one last little thing. Versus another restaurant we went to recently, that the person was so friendly. Nothing was a problem. They would, just wanted to make you feel really welcome and at home, and, really gave us an amazing experience. Again, that's a coaching and a people thing, and nailing that is really important. Culture can have a big impact, making sure you've got the right culture within your business, because that will make sure that you're able to retain the great people that you've been able to find. And culturally, most people want to have an impact, want to be able to have an impact on the outcomes of the business, not just financially, but, if you're selling a product that saves lives, or you're selling a product that's saving people or making people money, they want to know that they've come to work and done work that they're proud of. 2, they want to be respected. And 3, they want to be seen and appreciated. I think these are really common sort of principles that sort of define a culture, if you like. The next thing you want to think about is your employee value proposition. So why would the best people in your industry want to come work for you in your business? You need to have an answer to that question. You need to be able to articulate very clearly on what your value proposition is and how you're going to attract the best people in your business. So how do you do that? Well, you can study the best businesses that are either in your industry or very similar industries. You can ask staff feedback. You can test and measure initiatives. One thing I always talk about is the benefit that a small business has over a larger business is they're agile and they can implement things. Like a couple of years ago, we implemented a 4-day work week in our business. And most people would look at that and go, oh, that's risky. But it's not that risky. If it doesn't work out, we've very clearly said to everyone, this is a trial. If it doesn't work out, we can't do it in the future. Everyone knows that. You may as well try these things. Don't die wondering. So that's people, Mena. Let's talk about pricing, which is a super important aspect in business.
And one that we've frequently sort of visited in many of our podcasts. But back in season 1 and episode 5, we really sort of honed in on it as to why it's such an imperative part of any sort of business. And most recently, actually, last week, I sat with a client who was telling me about how they've gone through, he runs 2 hospitality businesses, and he was going through his P&L, and he was telling me, I've really fine-tuned everything. I've revisited suppliers. I've got the most competitive products. I've gotten the roster down pat to the point where I can't put any more staff on or can't decrease any more staff. I'm really at that point, but the business is just stagnant. It's not really improving. We're not going anywhere. And I simply asked him, have you looked at your pricing? And I was baffled by the fact that he hadn't actually reviewed his pricing in over 3 years. And I don't need to say about the inflation cost of late. How do you do all these things but not look at your pricing? And, we did this little analysis, and where we looked at if you increased your price by just 10%, for most small businesses, will actually increase their bottom line by about 15 to 30%. Now, that's huge. So, you really need to improve or have that visibility over your pricing. We always focus on the bottom line things. We never focus on top line revenue and what needs to be done from that perspective, because generally there's a fear, are we going to be increased price? Does that mean we're going to become less competitive, and people are going to go elsewhere? But, if you've got a unique selling position or a premium product or a service, then people aren't generally going to care about your price. Look at Apple. I still remember the first Apple iPhone was, quite economic. Now you're sort of looking at, what is it, more than $2,000, I think, these days, just for an iPhone. But people perceive value in the product, in the brand. There's a lot of other smartphones out there, as an example, that do what Apple do, and sometimes even better. But Apple have that unique selling proposition. So if perceived value is less than price, you'll have a successful business. So just continue revisiting your pricing. Don't be afraid to sort of increase pricing for your clients, for your customers or your suppliers, whatever it is. And get the help that you need. Ask your holistic accountant to do the analysis, the projections. Even if you increase price by 10%, okay, you might reduce, for example, your client base or your customer base by 5%, but that 10% might outweigh those customers, and they'll most likely be the wrong customers anyway. So hire the right consultants, benchmark yourself to other businesses to help you get a gauge of what your pricing needs to be.
And pricing can be a really difficult thing to do ourselves, particularly if it's a service. If it's a product, it's a little bit easier. And in a product category, you might be a price taker rather than price maker, which means that your competitors really kind of set the price and relative to your competitors, and there might not be much you can do about that. Well, then it's about thinking about your product suite. Can you get better pricing power, or is there something in addition to that product that you can offer that's going to add perceived value. If it is a service, quite often the owners of a business are the worst people to do the pricing, because quite often we're really conservative. We tend to be more conservative. We think we don't want to lose business. We don't want to rip people off, all those sorts of things. But what you need to do is have a really coherent pricing strategy in that regard. And we find that there's a lot of value in maybe bringing in external consultants about this, particularly if, and you'll find them in different industries, that there's consultants that are specialists in pricing. And the benefit there is they can benchmark pricing as well. So they can not only give you a coherent framework so you can articulate how you've come up with a particular consulting fee, for an instance, but also be able to go back to them and say, look, we've benchmarked this to the industry and this is why we think it's competitive. The next thing to think about is product and service. It depends on what your business is. Are you selling a product or are you selling a service? The key thing here is to really ask yourself, are you really selling a product or service that solves a real problem? They're the really great businesses, is where you don't need to invent a problem, or you don't need to educate your potential customer or client about a problem. If they already know that they have a problem and your product really is a solution to that, again, it's like rolling a ball downhill as opposed to rolling a ball uphill. Now, if you can't answer yes to that, if you're selling widgets and widgets really aren't changing anyone's life, well, that could be the thing that's wrong with your business, and maybe you need to, again, change the product suite to make it a business that is going to really be much easier to grow and scale than one that, isn't. Once you feel like you're in the right product category and you've got a product that really there is demand for that product or service, you then want to think about all the other elements like inventory management, the cost of producing that product, quality control, after-sales support and service. Make sure you've got the right systems in place to really harness that perceived value of that product and service and maximize it. If your business is a service business, then it's very likely that people are your greatest cost. So your wage bill is really probably one of your greatest, if not your greatest expense. And so then how do you maximize the amount of revenue per dollar spent on wages? And we talk about in a consulting business that the wage bill, you want to keep to around about a third of revenue. Another third goes to overheads, and then another third hopefully to profit, as a general kind of rule of thumb. And so then if you're going to spend $1 million on wages, how do you turn that into $3 million of revenue? Well, you've got to think about ways to automate, delegate. When I talk about delegating, using a cheaper source of labor or delegating to some sort of technology to automate something, or in fact even eliminate. So it's really about leveraging that cost base as much as possible. How do you do that? Well, you can survey your clients in terms of making sure that your product really hits on the element that they're really looking for, and doing some industry research to work what's going on. What are your competitors doing? How are they positioning themselves as well? But product could be one of the categories that you need to work on.
And finally, process. So how do you actually deliver your product or service to your customer? Now, we always talk about systemizing and creating processes to leverage, consistency in your business. I think, and I harp on about this, but I look at McDonald's as the perfect executor of process. How you have a whole bunch of 14, 15, and 16-year-olds producing the exact same thing day in, day out is mind-blowing.
Across the world.
Exactly. Yeah. So, systemizing can yield great results, and end of the day, you can't measure what you don't know. So you need to put in systems to measure, what your marketing and what your sales conversion is, what your delivery and your after sales service is, and some part of this actually involves, listening to your customers, as Stuart mentioned before, implementing, the likes of, for example, drop shipping, if you're in product-based business, can save you a lot in terms of logistics and so forth. So, you need to create a system to help you repeat business, improve your margins, and provide a service or product that's actually worthy of remark. So, there's a lot of tools out there. We use, AI as, a term that's, it's coined a lot. But how do we use AI to automate and systemize our processes? How do we improve our training, our technology? Even firsthand here in ProSolution, we've recently implemented a software system that improves the whole client experience in terms of the client uploading, the collaboration, how we can sort of share information more live in a secure manner. So How can you do this? Engage the right consultants. There's a lot of industry-based podcasts that help you engage or put you onto the right consultants, listening to what your peers or other businesses are sort of experiencing as well, understanding your tech stacks. And this doesn't necessarily need to be solely on you as a business owner, because not everyone is as tech savvy as others. So it might be worth, engaging the right consultants to help you build out these processes.
One of the best books I read about systems and processes was E-Myth by Michael Gerber. It's an old book. It's been rewritten in different versions. I think it's called the E-Myth Revisited now is the most recent version. But he talks about, systems really drive businesses, and spending as much time on your systems as possible really gives you that scalability. So even if you're in a business that isn't perfectly scalable, systems will help you squeeze as much scale out as possible. So just to sum up, we believe that it's either people, pricing, product, or process. One of those 4 Ps is you need to spend most of your time on one of those 4 Ps. And by doing so, we think that's going to give you the greatest return on investment for your time. And try to not get sucked into the day-to-day, get sucked into working in the business or putting out spot fires or those sorts of things. Really sitting back and asking yourself, out of those 4 Ps, what's the weakest element in my business and what can I do to make some improvements in that space? Okay, until next week, bye for now.